the reasons you might imagine. We are now in an advanced stage of a currency war. There are forces in the United States that would like the Chinese, to upvalue their currency, because that would make Chinese goods more expensive for us. Roughly these days, you get 6.5 renminbi for $1. They would like the renminbi to drop to 3 or 4, or something like that. Make it much more expensive. We would only get 3 or 4. It means the dollar's worth less and the renminbi is worth more. That would make all Chinese goods more expensive. And the hope of these people that are pushing Washington in that direction is you and I, would go out and buy other things than Chinese goods because the price would go up. Think of the shock on your face when you're burrowing around in the basement of TJ Maxx for a sweater that doesn't have 6 holes and 4 stains already on it. Imagine if it became 50% more expensive. Well, you wouldn't go. You'd throw it down and march off to Bloomingdale's to get a different sweater. This is the idea. That's very important. It's a very important idea. Why hasn't this then been done? Why hasn't the United States done this? By the way, a mystery for the people who want to beat up on the Chinese. But there's no mystery here at all. Because it turns out that here in the United States, there are lots of other forces that do not want the Chinese to make their currency more valuable. Why not? Because their profits depend on a cheap Chinese currency. Why? Somewhere between 50 and 60% of all the goods that come into the United States from China are produced in companies that are subsidiaries of American corporations. They spent a fortune. I'm including all the Fortune 500, all the corporations whose initials you know. They spent a fortune to close factories in Arkansas, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and move them to China. They invested a fortune. They spent to build a factory there, to produce it there and bring it here. They don't want anybody to mess around with the currency of China, because if it made the Chinese goods more expensive, they couldn't sell the stuff they spent so much money to produce in China here. So for every businessman or woman that goes to Washington to want to press the Chinese to change, there's 3 others dressed just as nicely, coming from just the same city, saying, "Don't you dare." Which is why, year after year, we talk about it, we worry about it, we have speeches about it. It's all bullshit. And it shouldn't be taken seriously. Which is not to say that it might not get such a kind of head of steam that something actually happens. That unfortunately could happen. You could get enough politicians to get caught up in a rhetoric they kind of would have to do so. That happens, sure. I'm not arguing that the actual economics always determines what goes on. So let's imagine for a minute that we were successful, that we browbeat the Chinese, assume we have the power to make their currency more expensive. Here's the first problem we would face in the world. The Chinese are going through an absolutely historic transformation, really unlike anything the world has ever seen. In a period of 20 years, a poor, backward agrarian society is in the process of becoming a modern industrial powerhouse. That normally takes many, many more years. It's traumatic in Europe, where it took centuries. Try to imagine what you are doing, uprooting masses of people and moving them across the country from rural to urban, different pace of life, different kind of food, different kind of sleeping arrangements. It's traumatic. For the Chinese system to survive, they have to provide jobs. If we were to succeed in making it really difficult for them to export, then that means they couldn't provide the jobs in their industries that they now provide because they export. China, as a social system, could not survive that. How do we know that? Because all their leaders tell you that. You read the speeches of the leaders, they are constantly explaining to the rest of the world, friends, you better play this game with us, because it ain't just we going down if 500 million Chinese people have to work. That's a serious problem for everybody. And nobody knows how that's going to play out. And one of the reasons nobody wants to shake this boat, except for politicians who are babbling during the election season, is because it is so scary to imagine anything happening to change this. Meanwhile, the underlying problem, the United States can't export its way out because the rest of the world won't let it. It's not just the Chinese. You know who else is angry at the United States if the dollar goes down? The Germans, who compete with us. The Brazilians, who compete with us. All over the world. No one's going to let us do that. We're not going to be able, we don't have the power anymore. For those of you who want to pine after the good old days of the American empire, it doesn't have the power anymore to impose this kind of relationship. It can't make the rest of the world buy American. It can't do it. And this kind of warfare and saber-rattling with the currency, which can of course quickly become saber-rattling with a saber, because the United States does have one thing that the rest of the world doesn't. The military capability to do unspeakable things, which it demonstrates in an ongoing way it's prepared to do. So I leave you with the thought that we are entering a time when the economic crisis is leading countries to try to do things at one another's expense that is a dangerous way. If you paid close attention to the IMF meeting over the weekend, this last weekend in Europe, and you listen to the words carefully of Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the French finance minister who is the head of the IMF and is now in a powerful position, he basically said that. He said, we need to do something because the cooperation we had the first couple of years of this global crisis is disintegrating. And we're now beginning to work at cross purposes. And he used a phrase called beggar my neighbor policy, which is the name that was developed in the Great Depression, when they couldn't coordinate anymore among the different countries, and every country tried to save itself by screwing the other countries, who only retaliated immediately and made everybody's policy fail. We are entering that situation now, and the very top people in the world are very concerned about it. The IMF meeting over the weekend in Europe was a complete failure. They were supposed to have a currency agreement, they didn't have one. They were supposed to announce coordination terms, they couldn't do it. They had a namby-pamby press release, everybody went home, and they're now going to work on it next month when the G20 meet in November. That's a sign of chaos. Next international dimension. There have been some countries that seem, please underscore the word seem, to have escaped the crisis, at least in terms of as bad as it's been here in the United States. Let me give you some names so we all know what we're talking about. China, number one, India, and Brazil. There are other countries, but those are the big three examples of countries that are doing extraordinarily well. Really extraordinary. What is going on? Well, as best we can tell, and now I stress as best we can tell, because what I'm about to say, and what anybody tells to you about China, India, and Brazil, depends on the numbers, the statistics that are given to us about China, India, and Brazil. And these numbers are always cooked. All numbers are cooked by somebody, and that somebody could be a neutral, objective person who doesn't want to do anything that might tilt the numbers one way or another. And if you ever encounter this person, please introduce me. Because I've heard that it exists, but I never encountered it myself. There is no such thing. So we are dependent on numbers that are themselves dependent on politics. But given that, the Chinese seem to be continuing to grow their economy at stupendous rates, 5 to 10% a year, which is 2-3 times what we're able to do here, year in and year out. They spend an enormous amount of stimulus to overcome the crisis. They spent over $500 billion. The United States spent 700 and something billion. Relatively close, but we're not close as economic powerhouses. If we were to do the same proportion as the Chinese, we would have had to spend 5 times the stimulus we do. A point that is made almost every day by Paul Krugman, who wants there to be a much bigger stimulus, and who uses the example of China to say, gee, look, seems to work over there, we didn't make a big enough one here.